The footprints shouldn't have been there. It was the evening of March 31st, 1922, and a bitter wind howled across the isolated farmstead of Hinterkaifeck, Bavaria. The last of the winter's frost still clung to the earth, blanketing the remote property in an eerie silence. But when Andreas Gruber, the family patriarch, stepped outside, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A trail of footprints led from the dense woods to the back of the house. Deep, precise, as if someone had walked straight toward the farm in the dead of night. And yet, there were no footprints leading back out. Whoever had come to Hinterkaifeck had never left. Andreas felt a chill crawl up his spine. He clutched his lantern and peered into the trees, scanning the shadows for movement. Nothing, only the whispering wind and the endless stretch of Bavarian forest. Still uneasy, he turned back toward the house, telling himself it was nothing. Perhaps a wandering traveler, a lost hunter. Nothing to be afraid of. He was wrong. Within 24 hours, every living soul on the Hinterkaifeck farm would be dead. Hinterkaifeck was an unassuming homestead, miles from the nearest village. The land belonged to Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, a husband and wife in their 60s, known for their bitter tempers and reclusive nature. Living with them was their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, along with her 2 young children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. The family's only other resident was their new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had just arrived that very day. Despite their quiet existence, the Grubers had a reputation in the nearby town of Gruber. Andreas was not well-liked, harsh, suspicious, and rumored to be abusive. There were whispers that Joseph, his grandson, was not actually the son of Victoria's late husband, but rather the product of incest between Andreas and Victoria, a claim that cast an ugly shadow over the household. But whatever secrets they kept behind closed doors, they were about to become victims of something even darker. In the days leading up to the murders, strange things began happening at Hinterkaifeck. The family dog started barking at empty spaces, its fur bristling as if sensing something unseen. A set of house keys mysteriously disappeared, leaving the family on edge. A newspaper from Munich, one no one in the family had purchased, was found on their kitchen table. Strange noises echoed from the attic at night, like footsteps pacing back and forth. And then there was the incident with the footprints, the ones that led to the house but never left. But instead of alerting the authorities, Andreas Gruber did nothing. He was a stubborn man, distrustful of the police, and refused to believe that something sinister was afoot. That mistake would cost him everything. The murders were as brutal as they were methodical. On the night of March 31st, one by one, the Gruber family was lured into the barn, perhaps by a noise or by the unseen intruder who had already been hiding on the property. Whoever the killer was, they waited until their victims were inside, and then they struck. A mattock, a heavy farm tool used for digging, came down again and again, smashing skulls and splitting bone like wood. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, little Cecilia, blow after blow, no mercy. And then, when the killer was finished with the barn, they walked into the house, as if they had always belonged there. Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had just arrived that day, was still lying in her bed when she was slaughtered. Baby Joseph was found in his crib, his small body crushed by the same blunt force. 6 lives, erased in a single night. But the horror didn't end there. The killer didn't just murder the Grubers. They stayed. For days, neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney of the farmhouse. The farm animals had been fed and tended to. Someone had eaten food from the kitchen. The murderer had not fled immediately. They had lived among the dead. It wasn't until April 4th, for days later, that the neighbors finally noticed the eerie silence at Hinterkaifeck. A group of concerned villagers rode out to the farm, knocking on the door. No answer. The dog, alive but frightened, was tied up outside, barking wildly. Cautiously, the men entered the barn. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The stacked corpses, their faces barely recognizable. The dried blood pooling into the hay. The smell of rot thick in the air. Inside the house, they found Maria's body still in bed, stiff with rigor mortis. And little Joseph, still in his crib, his small skull crushed. The farmhouse was soaked in death, but there was something even more disturbing. As one of the men backed away in horror, he noticed something scratched into the wooden beam above the barn door, something that hadn't been there before. 6 words, 6 terrifying words. "You will never be rid of me." The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of the most baffling and disturbing unsolved crimes in history. Whoever committed the murders had a deep knowledge of the farm, enough to lure the family members to their deaths one by one. They had access to the house keys and lived on the property for days afterward, either out of necessity or something far more twisted. The case was investigated by police, but no suspect was ever convicted. No murder weapon was found, no motive confirmed. Theories range from a vengeful former farmhand, to a deranged drifter, to a serial killer who simply vanished into the night. But then there are the more chilling theories. What if the murderer had always been there? What if, as some locals believed, the farm was cursed? What if something evil had been watching the Grubers for years, waiting for the right moment to strike? Even today, in the ruins of the Hinterkaifeck farm, visitors claim to hear footsteps in the dark, whispers on the wind. And if you step close enough to where the barn once stood, you might still see the imprints of footprints in the snow, but never leading away. The word scratched into the wooden beam sent a shiver through the group of men standing in the Hinterkaifeck barn. "You will never be rid of me." The chilling message was fresh, the edges of the carved letters still raw and splintered. Had it been written before the murders? Or had the killer lingered long enough to leave a parting message? No one wanted to say it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. What if the killer was still here, watching them? One of the men, a farmhand named Loren Schlittenbauer, turned on his heel and bolted out of the barn, his boots crunching in the dirt as he ran for the house. The others hesitated only a second before following. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of death. The bodies of Maria Baumgartner and Lil Joseph lay exactly as they had been found, Maria's stiff corpse still in bed, Joseph's small skull caving inside his crib. But as the men moved cautiously through the house, something felt wrong. When authorities arrived later that evening, they immediately secured the farmhouse. Or at least, they tried to. In the chaos of the discovery, some of the villagers had already contaminated the crime scene. Loren Schlittenbauer, the very man who had led the search party, had even moved the bodies in the barn, claiming he had been checking for signs of life. But was that his real reason? Schlittenbauer had a personal connection to the Gruber family. He had once been romantically involved with Victoria Gabriel, and some whispered that he, not Andreas, was Joseph's real father. Did that mean he had a motive, or was his distress real? The police found something even more bizarre. Some evidence had vanished entirely. The house keys, which had disappeared days before the murders, were never recovered. The murder weapon, a heavy mattock, was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. Yet someone had clearly lived on the farm after the murders. Whoever had killed the Grubers had left no footprints out, no bloody trail leading into the forest. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. As investigators combed through the house, one officer decided to search the attic. The family had reported hearing strange noises coming from above in the days before their deaths. Scraping, footsteps, whispers in the dark. Had someone been hiding there all along? The officer climbed a rickety wooden ladder, pushing open the small door that led to the attic space. It was dark and cramped, the air thick with dust. He shone his lantern into the corners. Cobwebs, empty crates, a few scattered belongings. But then his light caught something. A flattened pile of hay, as if someone had been sleeping there. And beside it, discarded food scraps, a half-eaten piece of bread, a cup with dried liquid inside. Someone had lived here, perhaps for days, perhaps longer. And if the noises the family had heard had truly come from a hidden intruder in the attic, then the killer had been watching them the entire time. As news of the murder spread, locals came forward with strange accounts. 2 coffee sellers reported knocking on the Grubers' door the morning after the killings. They had seen smoke curling from the chimney, but got no response. A local butcher claimed that he had seen someone in the fields near Hinterkaifeck on April 1st, but when he called out, the figure vanished into the woods. A woman in a nearby town insisted she had spoken to Victoria Gabriel on April 2nd, 2 days after her supposed death. Was this a case of mistaken identity? Or had the killer used the farmhouse as a hideout, posing as one of the victims to mislead the investigation? The deeper the police dug, the more contradictions they found. And then came the biggest twist yet. 10 days after the murders, a young farmhand arrived at the police station with a torn piece of fabric. He had found it tangled in a tree branch near the crime scene, stiff with dried blood, and inside the folded cloth was something even more disturbing, a handwritten confession. The note, smeared and barely legible, read, "I did it. I killed them all. They deserved it. But I was not alone." The police examined the handwriting, comparing it to records of family members and locals. But it didn't match anyone. If it was real, that meant there was more than one murderer. And that meant the second killer was still out there. As the investigation continued, locals began reporting strange happenings. A shepherd passing through the area claimed he had seen a man in dark clothing standing at the edge of the woods watching Hinterkaifeck, only for the figure to disappear when approached. A group of hunters found freshly dug soil near an abandoned campsite a mile from the farm. When they investigated, they found nothing, but the ground had been disturbed recently. A traveling merchant swore he had been followed by a silent figure in a wide-brimmed hat for 3 nights straight. The police dismissed many of these reports as hysteria, but those who lived near Hinterkaifeck weren't so sure, because there was something about the way the birds had gone quiet, the way the farmstead seemed frozen in time, the way footsteps sometimes echoed where no one stood. And then, on April 15th, nearly 2 weeks after the murders, another chilling message appeared. It was carved into the same wooden beam in the barn. New letters, new words. And this time it was a question. Do you still hear the whispers? The case had officially spiraled into a nightmare. A confession had surfaced, but no suspect had been caught. Witnesses contradicted one another. A possible second killer was still on the loose, and someone, somewhere, was still watching. But there was one last lead the police hadn't explored, one final clue hidden beneath the floorboards of the house. And when they found it, it would change everything. The message in the barn, "Do you still hear the whispers?" had shaken even the most hardened investigators. It had only been a week since the first eerie message was discovered. That carving had seemed like the twisted work of a killer taunting the police. But now, another message had appeared, freshly etched into the wood. This wasn't just an old crime scene. Someone was still here. The officer who discovered the second message swallowed hard, gripping his lantern as he scanned the barn. The silence was suffocating. No movement, no sign of who had left the word behind. And then, from deep inside the house, a loud crack rang out. The officers rushed into the farmhouse, boots pounding against the wooden floors. The noise had come from the master bedroom, the very room where Andreas Gruber had slept. The moment they stepped inside, they saw it. A section of the wooden floor had split open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. A low, stale stench rose from below, like rotting wood and damp earth. One officer knelt down, his hands trembling as he lifted the broken boards. Beneath the floor was a shallow crawl space, and in the dim light of the lantern, something gleamed. Metal. He reached down and pulled out a rusted, blood-stained mattock, the murder weapon. The discovery should have been the breakthrough they needed, but instead, it only deepened the mystery. If the mattock had been hidden beneath the floorboards, that meant someone had access to the house after the murders. That also meant the killer had been comfortable enough to return and hide the weapon in plain sight. And yet, when the officers examined the handle closely, they found something even more chilling, a set of fresh fingerprints. But there was a problem. The prints didn't match anyone in the Gruber family. So whose were they? And why was the killer still playing games? That night, as police locked up the farmhouse, a young woman appeared at the station. She was pale, shaking, her hands gripping the edges of her coat like she was holding herself together. Her name was Anna Kiefer, and she claimed to know something about Hinterkaifeck. The officers ushered her into a small room. Anna refused to sit. She stood near the door, eyes darting nervously around the space. Then, in a low, hurried voice, she told them everything. She had once worked at Hinterkaifeck as a maid. She had left suddenly, weeks before the murders, because of something unsettling. At night, she had heard footsteps where no one should have been, whispers coming from the attic. And once, just once, she had seen a figure in the dark. A man, standing in the barn, watching the house. When she had told Andreas Gruber, he had laughed it off, saying it was just her imagination. But Anna was certain. Someone had been lurking at Hinterkaifeck long before the murders, and she was terrified that they were still out there. The officers took her statement seriously. It was the first real confirmation of what many had feared. The killer had been at Hinterkaifeck before the murders, watching, waiting. But just as they prepared to investigate her claims further, something strange happened. The next morning, Anna Kiefer vanished. Her apartment was abandoned. None of her belongings were missing, except for the clothes she had been wearing. A neighbor claimed to have seen her leaving in the early hours, but with a man in a dark coat. The officers sent search parties into the nearby woods. They questioned everyone who knew her, but Anna Kiefer was never seen again, and with her disappearance, so vanished one of the only people who might have known the truth. Frustrated by the growing list of unanswered questions, the investigators turned their attention to the only other person who might hold answers, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. From the very beginning, his actions had been suspicious. He had discovered the bodies, yet he had also tampered with them. He had insisted on being part of the investigation, yet he also refused to be questioned. And strangest of all, he had known exactly how to enter the house. Even though the doors had supposedly been locked, the police confronted him directly. He didn't deny his past connection to Victoria Gabriel, nor did he deny his belief that Joseph was his son. But when pressed about the night of the murders, his story kept changing. One moment, he claimed he had been home the whole night. Then, when questioned again, he said he had been out searching for a lost calf. And then his alibi changed once more. When asked why his fingerprints might be on the mattock, he paused. And then he said something that made the officer's blood run cold. "I was just putting it back where it belonged." The police didn't know what to believe. Had Lorenz Schlittenbauer simply tampered with the crime scene out of panic? Or had he been hiding the murder weapon because he knew exactly who had used it? And if he did, was he protecting someone? The case was already murky, but now a terrifying new possibility emerged. What if Hinterkaifeck hadn't been the work of one killer? What if it had been the work of more than one? And what if, somewhere out there, at least one of them was still watching? Desperate for answers, the police made one last sweep of farmhouse. This time, they focused on the crawl space beneath the house. As they pulled up the last of the loose floorboards, an officer let out a sharp gasp. Buried beneath the dirt was a bundle of old, yellowed papers. The top sheet was covered in writing, scrawled, uneven, almost illegible. It was a diary, and the last entry, written in fading ink, sent a wave of horror through the room. "I hear them at night. The footsteps, the whispers. They are in the attic. They are waiting, and soon they will come down." The date? March 30th, 1922, the day before the murders. There was one last place the police hadn't searched, and what they found there would change everything. The discovery of the diary entry sent shockwaves through the investigation. "I hear them at night. The footsteps, the whispers. They are in the attic. They are waiting." The date was March 30th, 1922, the night before the massacre. It was the most terrifying piece of evidence yet. For the first time, police had proof that someone had been living in the house before the murders. And if that was true, had the killer been lurking in the shadow for days? Weeks? Months? Outside the farmhouse, a cold wind swept through the fields. The officers exchanged nervous glances. One thing was clear. There was one last place left to search. The attic. The ladder leading up to the attic was coated in dust, untouched for years. The wooden panels creaked under the weight of the officers as they ascended. The attic itself was a dark, suffocating space. Low beams, a thick layer of grime on the floor, cobwebs hanging like ghostly threads from the ceiling. At first glance, it looked abandoned. But then, in the far corner, they saw it. A pile of hay, flattened, disturbed, as if someone had been lying there. Next to it sat an old, rusted lantern, and beside that, a half-eaten piece of bread. The officer's breath hitched. Someone had been sleeping here, watching, waiting. But how long? And where were they now? When news spread, the town of Weidhofen was consumed with fear. If someone had been hiding in the attic, that meant they were familiar with the farm. They had lived among the Gruber family, unseen until the moment they struck. And then, just as police prepared to close the case as a dead end, a new witness came forward. An elderly farmer, Joseph Mayer, approached investigators with a chilling story. 1 year before the murders, he had been passing the Hinterkaifeck farm late at night. In the dim moonlight, he had seen someone standing at the farmhouse window. But here's what made it terrifying. Whoever it was, they weren't inside the house. They were in the attic, looking out, watching. When he told Andreas Gruber, the old man had dismissed it entirely. But Joseph was certain. He had seen someone living in that attic. And now, the realization hit everyone at once. The killer had never needed to break into Hinterkaifeck. They had been there all along. Investigators turned their attention back to the most suspicious man in town, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. His connection to Victoria Gabriel had been well known. He had even claimed her son Joseph as his own. But now, with new evidence coming to light, the pieces no longer fit. Lorenz had been at the farm immediately after the murders, before the police arrived. He had known how to unlock the doors, despite them supposedly being sealed. And most disturbingly, his alibi for the night of the murders kept changing. But was he the killer, or was he protecting someone else? The police pressed him harder than ever before. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he denied everything. But then, in a moment of frustration, he made a mistake. When an officer mentioned the hidden attic space, Schlittenbauer's face went pale. No one had told him about the attic. And yet, he muttered something under his breath. I knew he was up there. The officers froze. With Schlittenbauer growing more nervous by the second. The police searched his property, a farm not far from Hinterkaifeck. What they found sent a jolt of terror through the investigators. An old leather satchel. Inside, papers belonging to Andreas Gruber. A set of bloody clothes, burned in the fireplace. And hidden beneath the floorboard of his barn, a pair of boots covered in dried mud. Mud that matched the footprints leading to Hinterkaifeck on the night of the murders. The police had their man. Or so they thought. Because just as they prepared to arrest him, Schlittenbauer whispered something that changed everything. You think I did this? You have no idea who you're dealing with. And then he laughed. Not a nervous chuckle. Not a denial. A low, knowing laugh. As if he knew something far more terrifying than the police ever could. Determined to find the truth, police returned to Hinterkaifeck that night. Armed with lanterns and rifles, they searched the woods surrounding the farm, looking for any sign of the real killer. Hours passed. The cold wind howled through the trees. Then, a sound. A whisper. Someone was watching them. They turned toward the barn, just as a faint glow of a lantern flickered inside. A shadow moved. The officers rushed in, weapons drawn. But the barn was empty. Only the lantern remained, swaying back and forth as if someone had just let go of it. And in the dirt, scrawled in a shaky hand, were the final words ever found at Hinterkaifeck. I was never alone. The next morning, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was found dead in his home. His cause of death? Heart failure. But on his bedside table, there was one last letter, written in his own trembling hand. It read, You will never catch him, because you are looking for a man, and he was never just a man. The case of Hinterkaifeck was unlike any other. A farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, a family butchered in the dead of night, and a murderer who left behind only whispers and footprints in the snow. For months, the police hunted for answers. Suspects were questioned. Secrets were uncovered. But in the end, no one was ever charged. The murderer of the Gruber family had vanished into thin air. Or perhaps they were never meant to be found. The sudden death of Lorenz Schlittenbauer should have been the final clue. Had he died of a guilty conscience? Or had the real killer silenced him before he could reveal the truth? Police pored over his belongings, searching for anything that could confirm his guilt. There were the burned clothes, the stolen documents, and his final, cryptic note: "You are looking for a man, and he was never just a man." The words haunted investigators. What had Schlittenbauer meant? Was it confession, a warning, or something else entirely? As months turned into years, the investigation collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The only physical evidence, a set of footprints, led Hinterkaifeck, but never away. Witnesses swore they had seen strangers lurking near the farm, but no one could agree on their descriptions. The attic had been lived in for weeks, maybe months, but no one knew by whom. With no murder weapon, no solid suspect, and no clear motive, there was nothing left to do. By 1923, the case was officially closed. But for the people of Waidhofen, it was far from over. No one dared to set foot on Hinterkaifeck after murders. The farmhouse stood empty, its windows dark and hollow, as if the house itself had become a corpse. For years, travelers reported strange occurrences near the abandoned farm. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel when no one was there. Flickering lights in the windows, though the house had been stripped of lanterns. A voice, low, guttural, whispering from the fields, calling people by name. Some said it was the spirits of the Gruber family. Others believed the murderer had never left, that they were still there, waiting, watching. 8 years after the massacre, the farm was torn down. The townspeople wanted to forget. But before the last beam fell, workers made a terrifying discovery. Buried beneath the floorboards was a knife, rust-covered, blade dulled with age, and it was covered in dried blood. Had the murderer hidden their weapon in the house before slipping into the night? Or had they been planning to return? To kill again? Over the decades, countless theories have emerged. Some say it was a robbery gone wrong, but nothing of value had been stolen. Some claim it was a twisted act of revenge. But against whom? And then there's the most chilling theory of all. The murderer was not a stranger. The murderer did not break in. The murderer had always been there. Because if someone had been hiding in the attic, watching the family, then they had been playing the long game. They had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when they did, they made sure no one would ever find them. Even today, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's greatest mysteries. New suspects have been named and dismissed. New evidence has been dug up and reburied. New theories have surfaced, each more terrifying than the last. Yet, despite a century of investigations, one question has never been answered. Who was hiding in the attic that night? Was it a disgruntled farmhand? A vengeful relative? A wandering killer who slipped through the cracks of history? Or was it something else? Something that cannot be caught, cannot be tried, cannot be explained. And if so, could they still be out there, waiting for their next Hinterkaifeck?